Hello, everyone, and welcome to the ETA Notes presented September lecture series. I'm Lavanya Sharma, and I will be taking you through the lecture for Psychology 3-4. Just a little bit about me as a tutor. I work for a company called TuteMax, and I graduated from high school in 2023 with an ETA of 98.75. For psychology, I got a raw 43 score, and currently I tutor VCE Biology and Psychology as group classes, and VCE HHC as individual classes as well. Today's lectures are brought to you by ETA Notes. They started in 2007 and essentially have been providing students with free study resources all of the time because we understand that during VCE, sourcing resources and study materials can be another stressor that you guys literally do not need. So we have a lot of the resources available just on one site. As a preview of what we offer, here are the examples. Some of my favorite features are the ETA Notes calculators. I used to spend so much time on this, just trying to figure out what study scores I would need to get a certain ETA as part of my goal. Lectures such as this one. So these are absolutely free to attend and they do tend to get posted up online on YouTube as well. We have hundreds of downloadable study notes and newsletters where we provide students with tips on how to study better and more efficiently as well. So, just looking at what we will be covering today, we'll take a look at Unit 3 and Unit 4 content. I'll take you guys through a bit of a refresher, but the main focus is going to be on exam revision. So that means I will be mentioning key tips that you guys can use when studying this content. And then we will also go through our scientific skills. And in the end, we'll go through some general exam advice on how to begin your preparation and what to do the day of the exam to ensure that you get the best results possible. Okay, so at the start of the year, we started looking at the divisions of the nervous system. And we recognized that in order for us to interact with the world around us, we need the nervous system as a communication. And that's the knowledge that Vika is also seeking to ask you guys. So it means that they are going to ask you what is the purpose of the nervous system? And it's a common short answer question, wherein you have to talk about the nervous system allows us to communicate with the outside world by bringing in sensory inputs so that we could process them within the brain and we could coordinate an appropriate motor response. We have multiple different divisions of the nervous system. You must remember the names for all of them. CNS for the central nervous system is the only acceptable abbreviation. If you're wanting to abbreviate the others, you must write them out in full first in your short answer responses, and then you could put it in brackets and then start reading later. So I would have to write peripheral nervous system and then go through with PNS if I wish to. Just be very careful on the roles and functions of these as well. So when we talk about the central nervous system, we're including the brain and the spinal cord, which are responsible for a lot of the processing to occur. The brain controls everything that we do. So it's important that information is able to reach the brain in a timely manner so that we can coordinate a particular response. The peripheral nervous system, on the other hand, is more of like a highway through which information can travel. So we have sensory routes, aka afferent routes. I always say afferent begins with A, so it means we're going to arrive at the CNS. And it has efferent routes. Efferent begins with an E, so we're going to exit the CNS instead with motor information. In terms of the other branches of the nervous system, we have the somatic nervous system, wherein we're undertaking voluntary information, we're conducting voluntary tasks. It's really important to recognize that the sensory and afferent neural pathways are a key feature of the somatic nervous system as well. So if you're ever confused about a question, it's safe to go with the somatic nervous system. But we also have our automatic systems, right? So that's the autonomic nervous system undertaking everything without necessarily taking in feedback from the central nervous system. So regulating things like our breathing rate, our menstrual cycle, our digestion rate, our heart rate, things like that. And under its jurisdiction are two other systems called the sympathetic nervous system, which prepares us for fight or flight or a freeze response. In the event that you feel threatened by something, we will have an in-depth discussion about this. and the parasympathetic nervous system, which is our rest and digest system. This is the one that hopefully is active within you today while you're watching this particular lecture series. It's maintaining your homeostasis and ensuring that your body is functioning at the normal levels. We also have a side branch of the autonomic nervous system called the enteric nervous system, which is controlling everything in the gut. And that's not covered here because we essentially dub it the gut brain axis, and we will cover it later on instead. Just an example here of some of the questions that you guys can again expect to see within this area of study. So we can see that you can be given case studies and be asked to identify which nervous system division is relevant and what type of response is conducted. Quite often you can be asked to justify as well why you think a particular nervous system is active, in which case the key terms that I have used in the previous slide to explain the nervous systems to you should be used and should be apparent within your responses in order to score full marks. Now, there is something that we didn't specifically mention in the previous slide, but I will mention it here. When we talk about the central nervous system, one of the key responses that we have is the spinal reflex, which is an involuntary response that has adaptive value. So it's designed to protect you and minimize any damage that can happen. So it's like when you touch something hot and you have a tendency to go, you move away very fast and you do it without thinking. Your body has moved away first, and later on, you get the processing of the pain via your brain. So there is a sample response written here in response to that. But the only things that I want to mention clearly is talking about how important it is to mention that the brain does receive signaling. It just happens after we conduct the action. That sentence must be present within your response to gain full marks. And for short answer questions like this, I would highly recommend using the character's name that is given to you in the stimulus so that we can know that you're being very specific about your responses. And at the same time, if you're struggling to map out your response, a good general rule of thumb is 1 mark means one sentence that you have to write. So for a 3 mark question, you have to write minimum 3 sentences. And something that I tend to do is I will look at a question and I won't immediately start writing. I'll try and have a think about, okay, what am I going to write first? Sometimes that includes doing a little bit of planning. So write like scribbling out 2, 3 words with arrows in between them on the side of my page. And I would highly recommend this approach if you are someone who recognizes that you do 4, 5, 6 mark questions, but you lose marks because you're forgetting to put in certain bits of information, or you just didn't think of linking a particular topic to another. Try and have a go at these types of strategies during your exam prep so that by the time your exam comes in November, you're very well prepared for it. Okay, just to look at the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems, this is a very common multiple choice question where they give you a scenario and ask, okay, is the sympathetic nervous system dominant or is the parasympathetic nervous system dominant? Or they can ask you about the specific symptoms that you could experience when one nervous system is dominant. So my recommendation would be know 3 of these very well so that if you have to list them in short answer questions, you have them on your fingertips. But otherwise, you should be aware of the rest of them as well. We can love throwing in niche ones like the liver or the gallbladder just to throw students off their game. Another key important thing to remember is the language that I've used here. I haven't said that sympathetic nervous system is activated or parasympathetic nervous system is inactivated. Rather, I've talked about dominance. Within your body, we don't work like a switch. Rather, we sort of work like a seesaw. I'm not sure how good of an example that is, but the idea is that nothing is ever truly on or off. We don't go to 100 and 0. Rather, we remain in the middle ground. It's just that sometimes you can have 70-30, sometimes you can have 80-20, like that. So that's sort of what we're referring to. And if you are someone who is having trouble remembering what happens when we have sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system dominance, I would highly recommend relating it back to the reason why it occurs. So, if we're just looking at the sympathetic nervous system, you could say you want to dilate the eyes because if you are threatened, the example here is that a bear is in front of you. If a bear is in front of you, your brain wants to take in as much information as possible to visualize, okay, where can you attack the bear or where can you seek refuge and run from it? So, pupils dilating allows you to take in more light input. If you're looking at decreased salivation, it's because salivation is not a response that is necessary for survival. Sympathetic nervous system is great at diverting resources away from unnecessary body systems and moving it towards the ones that are absolutely crucial for your survival in that moment in time. You don't need to be digesting things, you do not need saliva. You need a lot of breaths though, because you want to get that oxygen input into your cells so that your cells can start producing energy, giving you something to fight with or run away with. Similarly, you don't need digestion, your stomach contractions decrease, your intestinal contractions decrease because you don't have, I suppose, a need to defecate essentially. Your gallbladder inhibits release of bile. You need bile to break down fats within your diet. Again, you're not digesting, so all of that action inhibits. But your liver is the glucose store of your body. So just a reminder that we need glucose in order to survive and in order to power our cells. It's one of the intermediates. So the liver will start to release those intermediates because we're sensing that there might be a need for increased energy required with the body. The adrenal glands will start to release adrenaline, especially in a fight, flight, freeze response, because we're dealing with short term stresses. And something else that happens is that the bladder relaxes. This is because normally it takes a certain level of effort to keep these bladder muscles contracted to hold in your urine. But because we're taking away attention from any system that doesn't help us survive, these contractions actually release and the muscle relaxes, which actually shows you why a lot of the time in cartoons you can see that people wet themselves if they're very scared of. So this is the type of reasoning that I would be expecting you guys to use when trying to remember this, because there's no point in memorizing, you must be understanding the content instead. We've also looked at the concept of neurotransmission. So currently we're looking at a synapse. You should be able to recognize the changes that occur here and recognize how do we annotate it. So I really hope that you guys can see my cursor. But essentially on the left side of the screen, we're looking at a presynaptic neuron. So this is the neuron before the synapse. The white space between is the synapse, the synaptic gap, or the synaptic cleft. They're interchangeable. And the blue neuron is the postsynaptic neuron on the right. So this occurs after the synapse. Key features of a synapse include the axon terminals, where we will have terminal buttons that have vesicles containing neurotransmitters. We will talk about neurotransmitters and their important roles. But these neurotransmitters are essentially released when you get an action potential. They're released across the synapse and they will bind to receptor sites present on the dendrites of the postsynaptic neuron. So you can say that it's a one-way communication path, and it's very important that you convey that as part of your responses because the presynaptic neuron will send information, the postsynaptic neuron will receive that information instead. Okay, and these are the main things that you would have to annotate in this part too. Okay, so when we talk about neurotransmitters, there are essentially chemical messengers that neurons use to communicate with each other. It's like how we use words to communicate with each other. Neurons use neurotransmitters instead. We learned about two main types of neurotransmitters. It's really important that you guys are able to recognize their specific functions and compare and contrast their overall temperament. Right? So what I mean by temperament is that glutamate is the main excitatory neurotransmitter in the CNS. It's more likely to make the postsynaptic neuron fire. But be careful of the language here. You cannot say it will make the postsynaptic neuron fire. There's nothing guaranteed. It just increases the likelihood. So because it's more likely to inspire the future neurons, it's really good in making new connections. And hence why we say it's important in things like long-term potentiation, which is the formation of those new connections and those really strong neural networks. And we say that glutamate plays a key role in things like learning and memory. GABA, on the other hand, and you are allowed to use the abbreviation right from the get-go, is the main inhibitory neurotransmitter within the CNS. Be very careful. Don't say they're in the body, just say they're in the CNS instead. Excuse me. GABA has a tendency to reduce the likelihood of the postsynaptic neuron firing. So it's really important in helping keep your body calm and reducing things like LTP. Now, that doesn't negate the importance of GABA because if you don't have enough GABA, you tend to have a lot of anxiety and overthinking because your brain is just always active. You need those regulatory mechanisms within your body in order to remain relatively stable and functional. Okay, so this is what you will be asked to do. You can also be asked to judge the impacts of over and under consumption of glutamate or GABA, and then explain what are they going to be in short answer questions. Now, based on these neurotransmitters, we've also learned concepts like LTP and LTD. These concepts show up on the exam every single year, so it's really, really important that you understand the language that is expected from you. We're looking at long-term potentiation, which is the increase in the strength of neural pathways due to repeated activation. This is long-lasting changes occurring at the synapse due to high frequency or repeated activation. That's why we say if you practice something, it makes it perfect because the more you do it, the stronger those neural connections become within your brain. So every time you think about a particular input, your brain is more likely to use that strong neural pathway, which is very reliable, compared to something that's quite weak. So I have such a scratchy throat today. We also have the concept of LTD, which is long term depression, where you have the long term pruning or decrease in strength of neural pathways due to reduced activation. So things that you don't use quite a lot, they will get snipped out. So when I did physics in year 10, I learned a lot of content. Now I don't do physics, so the content is pretty much gone. It's really important that you don't say like no activation, it must be reduced activation. You don't need to completely stop using something in order for LTD to occur. LTD is really important in ensuring that your brain is working efficiently. You cannot be storing every single bit of information. That is clutter, and it means it can interfere with the space we have available for storing important information that you need on a day to day basis, right? So, these are the key things that you would be mentioning when looking at these concepts, but be very careful about at the end of your short term responses saying what is the overall impact. So saying that, okay, overall this strengthens neural pathways, overall this reduces the strength of neural pathways. Okay, we are specifically looking for that terminology. And these processes are facilitated by different changes to synaptic plasticity, which is the ability of the brain to sort of change, the ability of the synapse to change in response to different factors. So we have things like sprouting, where you form new neural connections as you're making new like dendrites, or you're maybe making new axon terminals. You could have rerouting where you had a singular established pathway, but now you don't want that. You want an alternative pathway. Um, Sometimes this can happen in the case of brain injury. Otherwise, it can happen in the case of learning new information when you're relearning something. So if you learn something wrong the first time and you're relearning it, you could have rerouting. So both sprouting and rerouting are important for LTP, whereas pruning is the removal of those unnecessary synapses to make sure that the useful neural pathways are more efficient, and that's important in LTD instead. Again, you should be able to contrast these. This is just, again, a sample question that you guys could do. I would highly recommend looking at past exams on the Wika website as part of your exam preparation. Even if they're not relevant to the current study design, you could use them as practice questions rather than practice exams because a lot of this content is practically ancient and you would have multiple different questions with their expected marking schemes available for you to judge, okay, what's going on. And I would really recommend when you're judging your responses. Don't just be like, okay, yes, I got 2 marks, or yes, I got 3 marks. Actually interrogate what did you do that made you get the marks. A lot of students fall into the trap of just doing questions, but the point of doing questions is not to get a certain volume, it's to understand what it is that in general is a pattern across questions and what is Vika expecting you to do. So if you're looking at past exam questions, please take note of the language that they're using. Take note of the length of detail, right? The length of sentences that they're using as well. And ask yourself, am I losing marks because I didn't think of making this connection? Or am I losing marks because I didn't phrase the connection with the language that they wanted? Am I losing marks because I didn't have enough time? Really be careful and sort of make it a formulaic approach because sometimes when it comes to exams, people get really nervous and they start to fray at the edges, and then it's just a very messy affair on the actual exam day. But if you have formulas set in place, you have a conscious sort of like list of steps that you can undertake, you have formulas and patterns and scaffolds to fall back on. And it means that you can actually calm your brain down, even in the event of an emergency, like the exam stress, because your brain is like, no, I've done it before. I know I can do it again. All right. So just be very careful of that. We also learned about neuromodulators. So neurotransmitters worked on a smaller scale. Neuromodulators work on a bigger scale across the brain. You should be able to contrast neuromodulators and neurotransmitters. Just in terms of these ones, we have dopamine, which is very important for a multitude of different factors. The only thing I want to stress is that dopamine is excitatory and inhibitory. A lot of students tend to forget that. Just be mindful of those things. And we have serotonin, which is our mood and sleep neurohormone. And essentially, we call it happiness hormone because it makes you happy. But the key idea here is that serotonin is inhibitory, which is telling you that again, you don't always need the go, go, go green signal. Sometimes you need the signal to pause. You need to reflect so that you're not overactive and you can actually be feeling good. So this is a quick table to show the differences between neurotransmitters and neuromodulators. I would highly recommend noting this down or taking a picture because this is quite a common question that comes up in short answers. And students are expected to have a certain level of detail when they're talking about them. So just be careful to revise this. Um, I think just for the interest of time, I will leave these questions here for you guys to attempt, but the answers will be shown in like a second. So please pause the video because it's going to be recorded and attempt it instead. Okay, we talked a bit about the fight, flight, freeze response. So the idea that it's an involuntary, it's a physiological response. So you're actually physically seeing how your body reacts to something. And it's either to fight with something, so you're dealing with it head on. It's with for flight, you're wanting to run away, or you're wanting to freeze because let's say you have an axe murderer in your house. Maybe you can't fight them. Maybe you don't have a lot of places to run. But if you freeze and it's dark and the axe murderer doesn't see you, you might actually live, right? If you experience something like a freeze response, you actually have, if these are your normal levels of parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system, you already have elevated sympathetic nervous system, but over on top of that, you actually still have parasympathetic nervous system codominance. So it's not that sympathetic nervous system is not fully active because you still experience symptoms like dilated pupils, increased heart rate, but overall, you also have that chronic immobility where your body can't really move and you don't want to draw attention to yourself. So just be careful of that if you get a question on the phrase response. And these questions are very, very much scenario based, where the sort of formula that I would recommend is be very specific to what it is that they're asking. Use terminology from the question and then give your statements. Okay, this is what is happening. This is the particular responses that you would anticipate. I talked previously about the enteric nervous system, aka the gut brain axis. So, just a reminder that this is a bidirectional communication link between the central nervous system and the enteric nervous system. We don't cover too much of the HPA axis. I just put that in there in case people were interested in knowing because sometimes you hear terms but you don't know where they're linked in terms of the content. These two nervous systems are essentially connected by the vagus nerve, and we say that it's a gut brain axis because 90% of the communication is actually from the enteric nervous system to the brain. So, the enteric nervous system can do a lot of independent thinking by itself, but they do have a bidirectional link, so they have the capacity to influence each other. And that's because in our gut, we have lots of different gut microbiota, aka all the microorganisms that are living there. And because we're in a symbiotic relationship with them, they get a space to live inside us. And in return, they produce certain chemicals or hormones that are useful for us. So, for instance, serotonin is produced in the gut, and we need that in our CNS for proper functioning. So, it just travels through. Now, what happens when you have a dysbiosis? If you do not have enough gut, when you want to talk about dysbiosis or things that go wrong in the gut brain axis, you can either talk about variety of microorganisms, so you don't have a lot of diversity, or you could say maybe you don't have a lot of numbers instead. So we're literally looking at quality and quantity. If you have any negative influences to that, you're not producing enough of those hormones that you need for functioning. And because they're not going to your brain, you're going to be stressed. Because you are stressed, again, the brain, that 10% communication is still happening to the gut. So it becomes like a very vicious cycle. And if a question asks you, okay, how do we improve this? Always talk about having fermented foods and having low levels of stress to promote the health of the gut microbiota. Here's a sample response as well, just restating the information that I've given you. And this is something that I want you guys to get into the habit of doing during exam prep. Think about specifically where are the marks coming from? Because at the end of the day, you never know what the examiner's marking guide is. You're always having a guess. So start having a guess from now and then see when you're marking your responses, okay, how correct was my guess? The more you do it, the more you notice things, you can recalibrate your guesses until there comes a point when you're just very close to what the examiners are looking for, right? So get into the habit of doing that. Okay, we looked at the stress response for Celia's gas model as well. In this case, you are expected to be able to draw out this diagram. You're expected to be able to label each of the stages and understand what is happening in each stage as well. So for instance, when we have the alarm reaction stage, that's the first time we're dealing with the stressor. If it's a short-term stressor and it gets resolved, we end in this stage. You have the shock stage where essentially you have a lot of parasympathetic nervous system dominance because everything in your body kind of starts shutting down. You have that decreased heart rate, decreased breathing rate as well, because quite literally, you are not prepared to have enough resources to deal with the stressor. But when you have something like counter shock, your sympathetic nervous system dominance returns. You start um, or rather than start, but you increase producing adrenaline and you may increase cortisol as well if the stress is a little bit long term. Just a reminder that cortisol is a chronic stress hormone, so we're not going to be producing it if you're stressed for like a minute or something, right? Has to be pretty normal. Let's say that the stress didn't remove itself, you will enter the resistance stage where the increased cortisol release will improve your resistance to the stressor above this baseline normal levels. If you're ever drawing out this diagram, always remember to draw out these baseline levels. This is normally where students lose marks. But the only bad thing about cortisol is that because it's so good at sequestering energy and resources from all of our body systems, is that the first place it takes it away from is the immune system, because the immune system is not considered as necessary. And so people in the resistant stage are prone to things like common colds, flu, headaches, those little niggling worries. If the stressor, let's say, dissolves or just goes away, you exit the resistance stage. But otherwise, if it continues, you enter the exhaustion stage where you have produced so much cortisol that now your body is beyond depleted of resources. You're still producing cortisol, but cortisol doesn't have any place to take away resources from. You've kind of plundered your body systems. And so it means that you start to have those long term diseases because those body systems do not have the proper conditions in which it's supposed to live. So that's when we try to, or we get to see things like, depression, anxiety, that kind of things, or even gastrointestinal or cardiac issues. The only thing I want to stress is pay attention to the advantages and disadvantages of this model because evaluate questions are very common for the stress models. So asking, okay, evaluate the capacity of gas to explain stress. In that case, you could say something like, okay, it has advantages in the sense that it was the first to link stress to disease. It has three very clear stages, and it's telling us exactly what's happening, right? It's saying that, okay, cortisol is very important, but if you have too much of it produced, it was the first one to even link to severe consequences like death. And in contrast to that, it has its downfalls too. Like it was really ethically dubious the way Celly conducted it. It was conducted on rats. We're humans, so you can't fully generalize it either. And it does not take into account any psychological impacts. So when you talk about evaluate, we're asking you to make an overall judgment. We're saying, give me the pros, give me the cons, and make a judgment. Regardless of what you choose, make sure you make it very clear to the examiner that overall, I think this. Okay? That has to be present. Then we look at our psychological model, which is a Lazarus and Folkman's model of stress, where we appraise stress into two places. So you have primary appraisal, where you're essentially asking yourself, is this a me issue? Right? Do I have to deal with this? And you have a secondary appraisal where you're like, okay, yes, this is a me issue. How am I going to deal with it? So you could have a primary appraisal of either irrelevant. I'll give you an example of what this is. Year 12, I finished it. It's irrelevant to me. For someone who is coasting through year 12, who's really enjoying their subjects and is maybe really on top of everything, they might think it's benign, positive. So again, they're not going to have a stress response. But for the majority of you, and this is not something to be sad about, stress is a very common aspect of life and of VCE. You may be experiencing stress because you're like, okay, this is definitely relevant to me, and I'm not as prepared as I thought I was. In which case, you could go through either harm loss. Now, that's very past based. You're saying, I have already lost something. It's like, you know how you lose money? You may have lost time in year 12. Or it could be a threat. You're like, oh my gosh, the exam is going to come in the future. I am so stressed about that. Threat is always future based. Or it could be a challenge. If you feel the physiological responses of stress, but you still have some sort of excitement, or you think that you could get something positive at the end of an experience, it's going to be challenge instead. So you're going to say, okay, yes, the psychology exam is pretty stressful. But after I do it, I think I could get a really good study score and I could get into my dream university. So it's really just a hurdle for me to get over. So you're having a really positive impact. But regardless of all three, you do go through a secondary appraisal where you need to say, okay, you know what? My coping resources are adequate. I have my teachers, I have my tutors, I have study resources, and I have enough time. So in that particular case, you could use two coping strategies. Either you use approach strategies that are directly dealing with the stressor, or you use avoidance coping strategies where you're kind of placating yourself. I will say you can be asked to compare approach and avoidance. And it's really important to recognize that both are helpful. It's approach strategies normally tend to be very good, but if you're studying for 4 hours the day of your exam, you are not helping yourself. If anything, you would drain yourself even further. So in that case, you need an avoidance coping strategy like venting to your friend or like watching a little K drama, right? Something that can distract you for the time. Exercise is one of those things that can be an example of both depending on the scenario. But if you're saying that your coping resources are inadequate, you will have a stress response. And I would highly recommend that you guys go through and print this out or write it down and have a visual representation of this particular diagram. You also want to make sure you're able to judge a particular character's appraisal any point in time based on, is it related with the past, is it related with the future, is it related with a positive outcome. And just like the gas model, we're still expected to evaluate this model. So the great things is that it's so individualized, right? It's not a one size fits all. It does talk to us about psychological effects of an appraisal. The negative impacts could be the fact that it's really hard to measure. It's an internal process, and a lot of the time, you're not consciously thinking, is this a me problem? Sometimes you could just immediately have stress. So that means there's either an overlap or even a switcheroo between the primary and secondary appraisals. It's hard for us to kind of judge it. And at the same time, we get no input about whether or not we have any physiological responses. Right? So again, you would have to make an overall judgment of, is this model explaining stress to you in the way that you want it to be explained? We also have some other terms. These are very common, mostly in like multiple choice questions where they ask you, is this character showing context specific effectiveness, where you have a coping strategy and it's going to match the stressor. So if you have a test coming up, you actually study. If you have a marathon coming up, you run through. Right? There is a match between them. Something that wouldn't be a match is if you start running like crazy, like 5, 6 hours a day for your psychology exam, because you're not being tested on that skill. Or you could be asked about coping flexibility. So this is about how well can a character change or modify their coping strategy depending on the results that they're getting. If you find that, you've been using flashcards all year for psychology and it's not working very well, you should show coping flexibility by switching over to practice questions, switching over to studying with a tutor, whatever works for you. Because if you have a lot of coping flexibility, you're always changing things, you're able to handle stress in an effective manner. Okay, let me just take a quick water break. Mm. So after this, we came into area study 2, where we looked at learning and memory. In this particular case, we're looking at classical conditioning. This is something that comes on the exam pretty much every single year, so I would highly recommend knowing it. We have the before, during, and after conditioning stage. In the before conditioning stage, you have a neutral stimulus, which is just a random thing that elicits no response within you that we care about. You have the unconditioned stimulus that naturally produces a particular naturally occurring response, which is the UCR, right? Now, initially, your brain has not associated with them, but during conditioning, you continually show your brain that I'm so sorry. That should be the UCS over there. The unconditioned stimulus and the neutral stimulus are associated with each other. The neutral stimulus is always coming first. Unconditioned stimulus is coming immediately after it, or like half a second after it. You could choose either words, but you have to show that the time span is very little. Because otherwise, your brain cannot say that, hey, one thing is always preceded by another, right? But because your brain has made that connection over multiple trials, now when you only show the neutral stimulus, you can actually elicit the conditioned response, which now comes because you have learned. To be conditioned is to have learned. So let's look at it from an example, right? If we're looking at Pavlov's dog, for instance, the dog couldn't care less about the bell. All the dog cared about was the food because it doesn't have to learn. You don't have to teach the dog to salivate at the sight of food. But when you continually show the bell and then the food, the dog's brain already says that, hey, the food is always preceded by the bell. So if the bell comes, I'm expecting that the food will come after that as well. And so when the bell rings, the dog starts salivating. The dog has that conditioned response to the bell. It's really important in these questions to say what is your response to. If you're talking about the unconditioned response, it's to the unconditioned stimulus. So salivation due to food. If you're talking about the conditioned response, it's due to the conditioned stimulus, aka salivation due to the bell. This is very, very important to write, otherwise, you will not get full marks for these questions and they come for 3 or 4 marks in general. So again, here's a question that you guys can do. I would highly recommend taking a look at things like the mark distribution as well and recognizing that actually it's I would say it's quite easy to do well because a lot of students many times may not pay attention to the tiny things as part of their exam prep, and then you could see that only 10% of students are getting full 3 marks. But if you pay attention to these things now because you're aware of it, you can actually perform very well. We also have something called operant conditioning. So classical conditioning was very passive, you just learn something subconsciously, whereas operant conditioning is a voluntary form of learning. So you still have the three-phase model. In the first stage, you have an antecedent. You have to have some stimulus that is prompting a particular type of response. Then you have a behavior, which is the voluntary response. You choose deliberately to undertake it. And then you have a consequence, which is whatever is the outcome of that behavior. And we have a way of categorizing the outcome as well. I'll get into the categorization part, but whenever you're going through questions about operant conditioning, I personally always found that the antecedent was the hardest to get because you can identify the behavior through things like action words. You can identify the consequence with what happens after the behavior. But if you're ever stuck on the antecedent, just write the behavior and consequence first and then go back to the antecedent. So you're at least getting 2 marks out of the three, right? And always ask yourself, if this thing was taken out from the scenario, would you have the behavior? So I'll give you an example. Let's say it's raining, so I open up my umbrella and I don't get wet. My behavior is opening up the umbrella. My consequence is that I don't get wet. But what prompted me to open the umbrella? The rain, right? If the rain wasn't there, I wouldn't have opened my umbrella. So think about it in terms of that. Like I said, you have different ways of categorizing the consequences. So you could have positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, like that. Don't think about positive and negative in terms of good and bad. Think in terms of, are you receiving something or are you having something taken away? So if you have positive reinforcement, example, you get an award for being the dux of your school. You are receiving a desired stimulus. So it's positive. Compared to negative reinforcement, where you're not failing after you studied. Or the umbrella example, I don't get wet, right? I stay dry, but it means I don't get wet. So because getting wet is an undesired stimulus and I'm having it removed, it's going to be negative reinforcement. You could have positive punishment. You're getting an expulsion letter. Again, you are receiving. Now it's an undesired stimulus. Or you have negative punishment. You're being fined for a speeding ticket, let's say. in which case you're having your precious money, which is a desired stimulus, removed away from you. I'm doing all these hand actions because that's what actually helps me sometimes to figure out what it is that's going on. Be very careful about your characterization of the type of consequences. Really practice these questions because these also come every single year. Here's an example of something that you could look at. In fact, this was a very good question in 2019. It stumped a lot of people. So if you're doing practice exams right now, I would highly recommend doing this exam and really looking at, okay, how are we judging these responses? Okay. We also have something like observational learning. So this is even more voluntary and even more active compared to operant conditioning because now not only are you just repeating a behavior and then saying, okay, am I more or less likely to repeat it? Now you're actually saying that, okay, learning is not just something that you show others, you have a mental process behind it as well. So because you're recognizing those mental steps, it's more active. So we have five different things. I always use the armor. That's kind of what I imagine a pirate to say. And so armor to remember the different stages. It works for me. It doesn't. I don't know if it works for other students, but if it does, use it. If you have something else, make it stick because you need to remember the order of these stages. So you have attention where the learner is going to observe the model and then say, okay, what is the model doing? Normally, we observe people that we like, people that we respect. Next thing you're going to have is retention. So, in retention, you're forming a mental representation of the model's behavior, you're memorizing it. You have reproduction, where you have the physical or mental capacity to repeat a behavior. So, for instance, let's say my brother really likes it when I tutor students and he wants to do it as well. But he may not have the mental capacity to understand this content because he's 10 years old. Or let's say a daughter watches her dad drive a car and she really wants to drive a car, but she's 2 years old, so she doesn't have the physical capacity to drive a car because her feet may not reach the pedals. So that's what we mean here. You could have something like motivation, where you have the will or the desire to repeat a particular behavior, and you could have reinforcement. So just a reminder that reinforcement always increases your likelihood of repeating a behavior, and you have to state that statement, whether it's observational learning or operant conditioning, in order to receive full marks. Again, these questions are all going to be scenario based. Lucky last, and something that a lot of students maybe struggle with because it's new to the study design, we have the Indigenous people's ways of knowing. So here we're representing that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have the oldest and longest continuing forms of learning in Australia. So you know that the systems that they use are quite effective because the knowledge that has been passed down from thousands and thousands of years is still retained within the community and still being used. So we use something called the situated learning theory, which is essentially trying to say that you want learning to occur in the same context where it would be applied, because then you're practicing it in that same context, right? Which is why I always like when I've been giving you this PowerPoint, I have put in VCAL questions in there because learning should take place in the context where it's going to be applied. You're going to apply it in an exam context, so you have to do it, right? In this particular case, we also recognize that learning should be multimodal because the more ways you do something, the more parts of your brain are activated. So when you think back to it again, there's a higher likelihood that some part of your brain will remember, hey, yes, I learned this. So as part of the situated learner theory, you could have learning occur in a collaborative setting with peers from your community or with elders, right? It's in a communal setting, it's on country where that learning is going to be applied. So that means the learner is essentially present in a really great environment to apply that learning and to receive it as well. So again, you can have different forms of it. You can have observation and then you have imitations of the actions, or you can have unstructured learning through things like dance, ceremony, stories. Again, things that are easy for your brain to recall that actually make you engage with the content. And the emphasis here is on making sure that you are developing context specific skills. So, Indigenous people's culture, to the best of my knowledge, I hope I'm not wrong here, is not necessarily written in the sense that the Western culture is, that every single thing is documented. But the fact that the knowledge has remained tells you that the focus is not on just can you record bits and pieces of information, but it's actually can you apply it to the context around you and can you relay it to the next generation. So those are the key things that we want to stress when we're talking about the ways of knowing and the fact that the different ways are interconnected with each other. You do not work in isolation when you're learning concepts. Here's a question that you guys could attempt. I'm going to move on to the concept of memory instead. So, just a reminder, you will have to know what each of these memory registers does, what is their capacity, and what is their duration. Those are basic questions that Mika asks you. So, when we have sensory memory, that is the entry point of memory, where we receive the raw data, whether it's the literal photons of light or the literal sound waves. So it has an unlimited capacity, potentially, but it has a small duration, which is the catch. So for iconic or visual stimulus, it's about zero point 0.2 to zero point 0.4 seconds, aka zero point 0.3. For echoic or auditory information, it's 3 to 4 seconds. Now, this is to ensure that when you're looking around the world, you don't see things as like jumpy pictures, but you see it in continuation. And for echoic, that if someone says a sentence, you know how sometimes you say what and then you answer it as well because you've had that echoic memory. Now, if you pay attention to any stimulus from sensory memory, it moves into your short term memory, which is the working part of the memory where we're coming up with thoughts and we're remembering things for everyday use. Now, this has a limited capacity of 5 to 9 items, so 7 plus or minus 2 items, and a limited duration. Normally, it's 18 seconds to a maximum of 30 seconds instead. The way you could increase the capacity of your short term memory is by doing something like chunking. So instead of remembering one piece of information, you just chunk them together. So instead of remembering a phone number, I would just go like, I don't know, 0452, right? So that's a chunk that I remember. You remember it in the three chunks. Or you could increase the duration by something called maintenance rehearsal, where you just keep repeating things. So if you repeat them for longer than 30 seconds, they're going to stay in your short term memory. If we find that there is something useful that we actually want to consolidate and we want to move it into a long term memory, that essentially has an virtually unlimited capacity and unlimited duration because at this point in time, we say that people can remember things across their lives. They don't need to have a lot of like things being lost. Okay. When we look at long-term memory, we also categorize it in different forms. Now, this is where those scenario-based questions come in, where they will ask you, okay, what type of memory are we using? And then you have to justify it as well. So just be very careful on the justification we provide. We have either explicit memory, which is things that you can declare to others very easily. You could phrase them, compared to implicit memories, which is things that you don't necessarily need conscious retrieval for. You have sort of muscle memory for it instead. So your body knows how to react. So I'll go with implicit first because it's shorter. You could have procedural memory, so muscle memory of things like brushing your teeth, things like riding a bike, things like swimming. You don't have to think about it. It's harder to explain to someone how to ride a bike than it is to show them, right? And that's one of the characteristics. We also need to have something called classically conditioned memories over here, which is essentially like it sounds. It's simple responses that you have been classically conditioned to do, flinching or like blinking or like salivating. When it comes to explicit memories, though, you could have episodic. So, episodic is kind of like, I always think it runs like an episode in your mind. You have details of time and place, and you could visualize that information. Whereas semantic is just facts. Like, I just know the grass is green. I don't know when I learned that the grass was green, but I do know what my first day of high school was like, right? I do know where I went. I do know who I met, that kind of stuff. So be very careful about the justification. And if you get this in a 10 marker, make sure to give a definition for this as well. They love definitions in 10 markers. Even if you don't have an exact definition, try and explain it in your own words. We'll also look at some key brain regions that are responsible for different aspects of memory. So when we look at the amygdala is just important in the formation of the emotional aspect of memory. So if I was embarrassed on my first day of high school, the amygdala is only remembering the embarrassment. It is not remembering where is something happening or when is something happening. Rather, the way memory works is that you have different pieces of information sent to different parts of your brain. And when you think back to something, all those areas become activated and then they pull in their information into your short term memory so that you could have like a whole lived experience as opposed a cinematic experience of your embarrassing memories. Something like your fear responses can be your classically conditioned. responses due to multiple iterations, or due to the fact that it's just really traumatizing. So it means that the amygdala could assist in the sort of consolidation of that. Just a reminder that the amygdala will not be storing information, it's just being consolidated. And consolidation of your emotions is stronger when you have adrenaline release. So that's why if you think about getting really scared, you have a lot of adrenaline stored faster. If you're out with your crush and you feel a lot of adrenaline being released, you will remember those memories better than something else. In contrast to that, you could have the hippocampus, which is really responsible in the consolidation of explicit memories, right? So turning them from short term to long term. Again, it's not doing any of the storage. The storage occurs in the neocortex, and it's not involved in implicit memories, but it is involved in things like figuring out what's in the space around you. So the spatial memory aspect is present. Now, we're looking at the different brain areas. You are expected to know what they do, like what type of memory and what is the function that they're doing in terms of storage or encoding or retrieval. So be very careful of this. We have the neocortex. The neocortex is essentially the covering of the brain responsible for storage of explicit memories. You have the hippocampus, which is always encoding and sometimes consolidating explicit memories. Amygdala, encoding and consolidating emotional aspect of memories. Cerebellum, so that's actually my favorite brain part, which is encoding those procedural memories and consolidating them. And it does have temporary storage, but that's really, really important to mention. Do not say it has permanent storage because it does not. For permanent storage, we rather go to basal ganglia instead. And just a reminder that basal ganglia is the area where we have a lot of those dopaminergic neurons, so neurons that are making dopamine, which is why we say that even dopamine has a key role in learning and in memory. Because if you have it being released, you're more likely to remember something. We also looked at things like episodic or future thinking. This comes very often when they give you like research methods based questions and they say, okay, they did an experiment on this and this is what people are seeing. So, episodic future thinking is like you're imagining what your future can look like. But in order for that to happen, you need a base level of memories to remember, right? So, you need to have something like you need to know what your school looks like, or you need to know what your classmates or your teacher looks like in order to create an imagined future of, hey, when I get an award at the end of the year, this is how these people will react. So you need that autobiographical knowledge from your own life in order to create these memories. Um, Now, that's a bit hard to do if you have something like Alzheimer's disease, because Alzheimer's disease, as a definition, is a neurodegenerative disorder. So the neurons in your brain are dying, they are experiencing deterioration, and normally it starts from the center outwards. So it has a very high chance of starting in the hippocampus, which is why people experience those memory effects because hippocampus is turning your short-term memory into long-term memory. So you start forgetting things of what you did yesterday, and then in the future you start forgetting, okay, what did I do? Like, 10 days ago, what did I do a year ago? And it's quite a scary disease, I would say, at least for me, because you start forgetting your family, your friends, your experiences, and there comes a point when you forget who you are as a person because the neurons in your brain that were holding that information together are just not present anymore, right? Which is why if you look at the brain of someone with Alzheimer's, the brain is normally shriveled a bit because we have lost brain volume and we have no ventricles, so essentially you have no holes there. And this occurs as a result of essentially like protein changes. So I always say tangles. Tangles are in your hair. So this is protein buildup inside the neuron compared to amyloid plaques. Plaque is on your teeth. So it's going to be between neurons in those synapses, literally acting as a clog. So you can't like send neurotransmitters. And like I said, it means you can't retrieve those long term memories of autobiographical events. So you can't imagine those futures. Because if I forget what my wife looked like and what she did, I can't really imagine, okay, when we're 90 years old, what are we going to do? Right? With aphantasia, you can also have trouble with episodic future thinking because this is the inability to voluntarily visualize imagery. Voluntarily is very important. Some people with aphantasia, because it's like a spectrum, people with aphantasia can sometimes have dreams where they're still visualizing information, but if they deliberately want to visualize something, it's hard to do that. So that's why if you're wanting to have future thinking, you're kind of thinking in terms of like semantic facts rather than I see a scene playing out in front of my eyes. We also learned about something like mnemonics, very, very common in research methods questions, multiple choice, and short answer questions. So you really get everything out of them. Just remember their definitions. We have something like acronyms, where you essentially get the first letter from multiple different words, bring it together, and make a pronounceable word. Very important. Okay. If you're going to use examples, make sure the examples are correct in your short answer responses. You can have an acrostic where you essentially have a bunch of information you have to remember. Normally, it's in a sequence, and so you just make up a sentence to remember it because a sentence always has a sequence. Or you have the method of loci, where you associate a location with a particular piece of information. So I actually did the method of loci in year 12 when I was trying to remember memory. So I would say, okay, I'll enter my room and then I'll come across my earphones for echoic memory. And my table, by the way, is a place where I put all sorts of information. I can't show you right now, but there is a lot of stuff on here. So I always think of this as sensory memory, where you have like that unlimited capacity. And then I had my glasses here as well, because I wear glasses. So that's the iconic memory part of it. Um, and that's the way that it works. So I'm associating a particular thing, location, with a particular piece of information instead. So here's an example of how you can phrase responses for the method of loci, and I've given you a formula that is a pattern that I have noticed from exams, and this is quite foolproof. Okay, so I would recommend checking this out. We also have mnemonics from oral cultures, like that of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. So you can have sung narratives. So quite literally, you're like singing out big chunks of information so that they can be stored in your short-term memory. But the idea is that you have things like a rhythm, you have things like the auditory aspect, and you probably have the visual aspect of it as well. So it means that again, there's stronger encoding because so many different parts of your brain have retrieval cues, either on a beat or a tempo or a melody that you can pick up. That's why we use things like music. It helps a lot with memory because it's inspiring those different parts of your brain. Or you could have songlines. Songlines are a little bit different and more specific in the sense that they're specifically tracing journeys. And they are linked to cultural information. So something like the method of loci, for instance, you could just randomly use it for anything. Whereas this is about describing landmarks while you are on country, right? A lot of the time, encoding them within songs so that your brain can actually consolidate that information better. Alrighty, let's get started with part two. I think we're almost just in time. Here we're going to look at sleep and mental well-being. So just a reminder, we do not have the term normal waking consciousness as part of the study design anymore, but we still have altered state of consciousness. So we need to understand what that means. So if something is an altered state of consciousness, it means that it's not the normal state, which is like this when you're awake, when you're aware of your mental activity and you're aware of your surroundings. But an altered state of consciousness, you're probably not aware of your surroundings and you don't know what's going on. And this is something that can be natural, so something like sleep, or it can be induced, either via things like meditation or via things like drugs as well. So when we have something like sleep, which we do say is a psychological construct in the sense that it is really hard to measure, we have to find ways of trying to categorize when are people sleeping and what stage of sleep are they in. So we use these objective measures along with subjective measures. The top three, EEG, EOG, EMG, are objective measures. So they give you numerical values that is just numbers, there's no words to it. So we always say that they detect, they amplify because the recordings of your individual cells are too little for us to derive any meaning from it. So we must amplify them, make them bigger. And then they record electrical activity because again, action potentials have been set. Your body is working on electricity. When we look at an EEG, we're measuring the brain waves. So sorry, the beta, alpha, theta, delta waves. Um, when we look at EOG, we're looking at the muscles controlling eye movements. Remember, we cannot attach electrodes to your eyeballs. That's very uncomfortable. It can cause damage. So we attach it around the muscles of your eye so that when your eye moves, those muscles also experience electrical activity. Or you could have EMG, which is your muscle tension in general in other parts of your body. So again, objective measures really, really good in case studies. If you can have subjective measures where you're getting like verbal information from patients, that could be sleep diary. So people are telling you, hey, I slept well, or I slept at this time, or this is what I ate before sleeping, this is the level of exercise I did. Or you could have video monitoring where essentially you're looking at how a person sleeps, and an experimenter is making a judgment on which stage of sleep are you in. When did you say that you're sleeping? When can we say that you are dreaming? Okay, just be very careful about this because they can ask you which form of sleep measurement should be used and then to contrast between them. So we also have things like our sleep stages. We have two main stages of sleep. You have REM sleep, which is rapid eye movement sleep. So this is happening when you are dreaming, um, most of the time. And as a result of that, your eyes move rapidly because you're still seeing information, but that happens underneath your eyelids. So we tend to have really high EOG recordings, but you have it's like paradoxical sleep because you cannot move your body physically. So you don't have a lot of EMG recordings, but your brain waves do have increased frequency and decreased amplitude. So they're very fast, is what we're trying to say. Short and fast. We call them beta like brainwaves. Be very careful on the language used. Okay, don't say it's beta brainwaves because those are only present when you're awake. It's beta like. And again, this is really important for things like mental recovery and consolidated bits and pieces of information. We always say that dreams and the subconscious like mind is trying to process information that you maybe have been thinking about. Like I've had weird dreams based on like books that I read in like year 12 or like year 11. And then I've had dreams about them in university, and I'm like, wow, I finally understand the plot of this book, right? Or I'm making connections. That just tells you, like, they can be very random, but it's a way of having some kind of mental recovery. Okay. Or you could have non-rapid eye movement sleep, which is majority of the sleep that is focused on physical recovery as well. And I believe we'll see later on that your body always prioritizes physical recovery first, because if you do not have your body, it's kind of hard to survive. The mental recovery is secondary to physical. In this case, you do have different levels of sleep because you have three different stages. So in the first stage, you still have increased frequency, decreased amplitude. We're looking at alpha brain waves. In the second stage, it's slower frequency, increasing amplitude. So it's essentially getting taller. And we're looking at beta brain waves. And in very, very deep sleep, you have the highest amplitude possible, and you're literally cruising through. So the frequency and speed is very, very low. So we say that those are the delta brain waves. And the deep sleep is where the majority of that physical recovery occurs, which is why we say that because children tend to have a lot of um, non-REM stage 3 sleep, that's why they grow a lot. And that's why even if they get sick or they get injured, they recover very fast. Whereas someone like elderly who do not have as much stage 3 sleep do not recover very fast because their body is not giving them enough time to do it. We lose our access to stage 3 sleep as we age. Um, I should have put this first, but essentially, we have different rhythms when it comes to sleep and when it comes to regulating any part of your body, because your body has an innate timing scale that it uses. So we can have something called ultradian rhythms. I always say ultradian stands for under, so it's under 24 hours, under a day, where you include things like your sleep cycle. So that's like the 1.5 hours it takes you to go through a cycle of non-REM and REM sleep. It can include your sleep episode. So that's where you're sleeping for 6, 7, 8 hours a day. And the idea is that essentially ultradian rhythms are smaller things, whereas your circadian rhythm lasts about 24 hours. This is the sleep wake cycle. When are you sleeping and when are you staying awake? Now, when we don't have environmental cues, we find that it lasts for like 25 hours instead of 24. The key thing to take away from here, though, is the circadian rhythm part because they tend to ask a lot of questions surrounding it. Okay. Um, we also look at something called the SCN of the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is the part of our brain that is like the master clock that is controlling our sleep wake cycle based on different environmental cues. You are expected to know that the environmental cues are called zeitgests. So I should have added a picture here. But essentially, what you have is that you have the SCN. And okay, let's start with the eyes instead. Because if we're giving the example of light, your eyes can take in light during the day. That information is sent to the SCN, and this is an acceptable abbreviation in the exam because it's written as SCN in the study design. And SCN then talks to like a worker in the brain called the pineal gland. Now, the pineal gland is like a hormone secretion factory where we produce melatonin, and melatonin is the sleep hormone. So if you're getting a lot of light in, the SCN is essentially saying it's daytime. I do not need sleep. Stop producing melatonin. So you experience essentially greater levels of alertness. But if it's nighttime and you're not seeing a lot of light, the SCN is saying, hey, it's time to sleep. We need more melatonin. And then you start to feel more drowsy instead. And as part of your sleep wake cycle, you have periods where melatonin levels are higher compared to when they're lower. This does differ between people, but conventionally, because we function in a society where we are awake during the day, we're going to say that melatonin levels are usually higher at night. And one of the key factors of the sleep wake cycle is light. Nowadays, we can sort of control it with artificial light, but back in the day, it just used to be normal sunlight that people would see. Now, something we also want to remember, and I feel like I'm jumping a bit between topics, but sleep is one of the topics where you need to remember numbers a lot. If you're someone who struggles with it, please make tables, please make flashcards, review this information on a regular enough basis because I can guarantee you some sort of question is going to come on the exam asking you to provide numbers for the topic of sleep. Whether it's about how is sleep changing across the lifespan or what is the total amount of sleep that you require. Oops, sorry. So the key things to note is that as we age, our demand for sleep decreases. So we don't tend to sleep for as long. The quantity of sleep is decreasing. So newborns, for instance, or infants are sleeping for up to 16 hours a day, which is huge. Whereas by the time you're like a teenager, you're sleeping for like 9, 10 hours. Once you're an adult, you're sleeping for 7, 8 hours, and once you're an elderly, you're sleeping for 6 to 7 hours. And that's to do with the age based deterioration of the SCN. Quite often, it's just not able to keep you asleep, right? And I see my parents having that as well because they're increasing in age, and you could tell that they're like, oh, I'm waking up earlier, or the fact that I'm not able to sleep for as long as I was able to once, right? So those are different changes and the reasons why they can occur. But the changes in terms of the stages of sleep can also be different. So over your lifespan, your REM sleep decreases. So when you are a child, you're sleeping for 16 hours a day, and you actually have 50% REM and 50% non-REM. And quite often, you could just start off your sleep cycle with a REM sleep. And that's because these little children are so new to the world that their body does not know what a sleep-wake cycle is. So it takes time to regulate that in the first place. What also happens is that you really need REM sleep for that mental consolidation. You're learning so much information when you're born. You're learning about, okay, what is the external environment like? Who can I trust? Who are my parents? What is language? How do I communicate with people, whether that's verbal or non-verbally? And a bunch of other things. So you need more time in REM sleep in order for your brain to process that information. But as we grow older, because we've learned majority of the information already, we get less and less REM sleep until it gets to about 20-25% for elderly. And in a similar way, we need so much energy for growing up when we're younger that we spend a lot of our time in that physical recovery period of non REM stage 3. As you grow older, you don't have a requirement for, I suppose, staying asleep that long and having that much non REM sleep. So we lose non REM stage 3. And like I said, that's why diseases, that's why illnesses get worse when we're looking at people of an older age because they're not getting these repair mechanisms as ready. Okay, I will just say for something like sleep deprivation, please be very clear about the different categories. They do tend to put in a lot of multiple choice questions on this. Okay, even the previous one, they ask a lot of multiple choice questions and they ask about graphs. So you would have graphs in your textbook. Just make sure you're aware of what they're saying. If you memorize the graph, you're pretty well sorted for sleep across the lifespan. With sleep deprivation, we're talking about inadequate quality or quantity of sleep, and that can have bunch of different effects. So you could have affective effects where you're experiencing changes to your mood and your feelings. So you're feeling irritated, you're really short-tempered. Maybe you can't control your impulsive behavior anymore. And it also means that you have amplified emotional responses because the part of your brain that is supposed to be controlling and keeping a leash on your emotions is tired, right? So it means even if something shouldn't normally upset you, you start bawling, or if someone shouldn't anger you, you start raging, something like that. Or I don't know if you guys have seen this, but sometimes when I'm really tired, or if you have experienced it, you start laughing out of like delusion and delirium because again, you have that amplified emotional response, even if something is not that funny. But what also happens is you have trouble judging other people's emotions as well because you need processing power in order to say, okay, does someone seem neutral or do they seem negative or do they seem angry? Right? So those kinds of changes can happen. You could have behavioral changes. So this is actually actions that you can undertake. So you could have excessive sleepiness, you could be very fatigued. You could take micro sleeps, so sleeps that last for 1 to 2 seconds because your body is so sleep deprived. And it can happen a lot with people who are driving as well. They're just like zoning out behind the wheel. You could have reduced motor coordination because, again, your brain has a delay in processing that voluntary information. So if you're playing something like AFL, maybe you had to catch it or you had to throw it in a particular way or distance, but your mind has not been able to make the correct calculation to do that. Or you could have something like sleep inertia. So just a reminder, if we don't do physics, inertia is the tendency to continue doing something that you were already doing. So if you're already sleeping, you want to just continue sleeping. You feel so groggy when you're waking up. We can also have cognitive effects. So this is all to do with the psychological side of things. So maybe you can't give something your attention. Like I find that when I'm very sleep deprived, my expression is literally like this because you have to focus more in order to derive the same levels of information from maybe a piece of text or a diagram or whatever it is that you're dealing with. Sleep deprivation can impact things like your memory, it can impact your ability to think. But this part on the bottom is actually very important to remember. When you are sleep deprived, you still have the capacity to do well on complex tasks because your brain recognizes that, hey, the stakes here are high, I cannot miss it, you know? But if you are sleep deprived, something like a simple or a boring task, especially if it's repetitive, like brushing your teeth or walking to school or something like that, it's actually more prone to errors because your brain thinks it's easy, so it's kind of like laxes and it doesn't pay the attention that it would normally pay. Okay. All right. We have our topic for sleep deprivation as well. Please just remember these numbers. They are very common short answer questions when we're comparing blood alcohol concentration to sleep deprivation. So you must remember that when people are sleep deprived for about 17 hours, um, we say that their blood alcohol concentration is equivalent to 0.05, right? Um, and when they're sustained awakeness for 24 hours, they have a blood alcohol concentration of 0.10, which is actually the legal limit. So it's essentially showing you the comparison, but then you have to make a judgment about which is worse, right? Normally, we say that sleep deprivation is worse because small amounts of alcohol consumption can sometimes have like a pretty calming or happy effect on your mood, right? It would still have like the negative cognitive effects or maybe the negative behavioral effects, but with alcohol, you can experience some positive effective. But with sleep deprivation, it's always like a lose-lose situation. So anytime if someone is complaining to you about this, or you have a question that's saying, okay, which one is more important? You got to say that sleep deprivation is more important because with sleep deprivation, the only thing that cures it is sleep. Otherwise, you accumulate sleep debt instead. Let's move on to something like circadian rhythm sleep disorders. So, this is essentially when the timing of your sleep wake cycle is not ideal, and there is a mismatch between the demands of your life and the time when you have to sleep. So, we learned about three different ones. You must know their definitions, and you must know how we use treatment like bright light therapy to cure it, and what time we administer that treatment. So for delayed sleep phase syndrome, because it says delayed, you are essentially delaying the time of your sleep. You want to sleep later. But as a result of that, you want to wake up later as well. But because society functions mostly during the day, it means that many people still have to work during the normal time and they end up being sleep deprived. So this is happening because of that later than usual release of melatonin, and it's quite common in adolescents. So if you are someone who is trying to fix this with bright light therapy, you would be giving people bright light during the day because melatonin production is like a 12-hour cycle. So let's say you have really bright light at 6 a.m. You're going to be super awake. 12 hours later, your melatonin was high and then it will be high again and you will be super awake. So by the time it comes to like 10, 11 p.m., your melatonin production starts to be like, okay, let's get back into the zone of things and let's actually start producing more melatonin so that we feel more sleepy. I hope that makes sense. Because when you have advanced sleep phase syndrome, in this case, advanced really means bringing it kind of forward or ahead in time. So instead of sleeping at like 10, you have a tendency to sleep at 6 p.m. in the night. Now, normally this is not as bad because like you're just awake during the night, but it can be uncomfortable for people and it's quite common in the elderly because you have an earlier than usual melatonin release time. So in order to cure it, you give people access to bright light therapy in the evening. So maybe you give it to them at 6 when they normally sleep because now their melatonin production goes down. So by the time again 10 or 11 p.m. comes, the melatonin is up again and they can sleep in the normal time. Or you could have shift work, in which case it just depends on the hours that you're getting. All you want to mention is that you want to give yourself bright light therapy before starting your shift so that you're very awake during that time. Then you also got to make sure that when you're not on the shift, you're wearing like dark sunglasses or you have noise canceling headphones or you have like dark heavy curtains so you're not exposed to light that can fry up your sleep cycle even more. Okay? I hope that makes sense. Otherwise, there's also the chat where which you can use to ask questions and I could answer them for you. All right. Let's also talk about mental well-being as a concept. So this is the one that you guys should have learned most recently. So I'm really hoping that it's still fresh in the mind. But essentially, when we're talking about mental well-being, there are different characteristics, and it's not simply the absence of mental health disorders. Rather, we say it's a continuum where people can fluctuate and they're influenced by internal and external factors. So sometimes you can have internal factors like your health, sometimes it could be worry, sometimes it could be finances, or you could have external factors like maybe someone is telling you certain things. Like if you're being bullied, for instance, you may not have good mental well being because no one likes being bullied. If you have a lot of workload in school or at your workplace, that could also impact your mental well being. The criteria we use to judge mental well-being is called functioning, resilience, and social and emotional well-being. If you are functioning, you're able to individually operate within the environment. So it means you're independent and you can do your basic things like showering, like cooking, like going to work, like studying, those kinds of things. You do not need to rely on someone to achieve those basics, as we like to call them. If you are resilient, it means you have the ability to cope with the demands of a stressor and sort of bounce back or restore adaptive functioning. It's really important to use the term restore adaptive functioning or bounce back. Bounce back is a bit more casual. Um, if you get my drift, you want to use appropriate language. But you want to be able to essentially restore adaptive functioning because that's the point of resilience. If you were here before and you fell all the way down and you just got here, that's not really resilience. Resilience is saying that you fell down and you tried to do your best to reach the top, if not the same level, higher, right? Something like that. So it means that the situation did not get the best of you, essentially. And resilience is really important with mental well being because not only is it resilience with everyday things, like, if someone gives you negative feedback, you got to be resilient and just take it on the chin, but also resilient with other life stresses, like, death of a loved one or like changing countries, something like that. And these types of questions come in a scenario format, I will say. So they'll ask you, is the character showing resilience or is the character showing positive levels of function? We also have something called social and emotional well being, just in general, where we're saying, okay, how well can you interact with the people around you and how well can you manage your emotions and express them appropriately? So that doesn't mean you're always happy because I don't know if someone is banging up your car in front of you, you're not supposed to be like, hey, mate, what are you doing? Let's not do that, right? You are allowed to be angry. You're allowed to be sad if the situation calls out for that emotion. But if not, in that particular case, you need to learn how to manage them appropriately, and that's a sign of having positive mental well being. Now, I recognize that might be a bit confusing because I've just jumped from social and emotional well being to social and emotional well being model. But the model is specifically for those from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander backgrounds. The social and emotional, these three, we normally use for non Indigenous people instead. When we look at the social and emotional well being model, we're actually recognizing that your health is not just your physical and your mental or your social well being. Rather, you have multiple different dimensions and they are related to each other in the sense that if something happens to one, it's going to have flow on effects on your other dimensions. So you need to recognize what these effects are and you need to sort of rank them as well. So, based on my understanding of the text and the subject, for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, this social well-being is really, really important. And then comes emotional, and then comes the individual. Because the idea is that if the community is healthy, the individual will also be healthy. So the individual is very, very reliant on others in order to experience positive mental well-being. So we still have different domains. So you still have things like the body, where you're thinking about your physical health, you have the mind, thinking about your mental health. But you also have things like your family, considering what are the closest interpersonal connections you have and what is the quality of those connections? Are they uplifting you in life? Are they actually helping you improve, helping support you? You have the community, which is, I suppose, the flow on relationships you would have with others. And you have your culture, which is your way of living, your heritage, your traditions. How do you think about the world, essentially? That's what culture teaches you. You have your land, very, very important, connection to country, because for Indigenous people, country is not just a piece of land that you live on. Rather, it's the place, the environment that provides you with everything you need to live. So there's a deep level of respect that comes with it and a sense of responsibility because the land provides you with so much things like food, like art, like shelter, everything. You must take care of it back. You must be responsible. You must be sustainable in the way that you are dealing with it because damage to the land is ultimately, in the long term, damage to yourself. And that's why we see that many Indigenous people have a very deep connection to country. And if there are things going on in country that are not very good, so things like mining projects, or how we have a lot of like coral reef destruction in Australia, that could actually impact the mental well-being of Indigenous people because something that is so important to them that they're so culturally connected to is being damaged. So they're not going to be happy about it. Very understandable. And we also have spirituality or connection to our ancestors, where we're dealing with like what is the spirit, what are the different ceremonies that you can do to improve your spirit, and what can you do with other people, including rituals, what sort of reviews do you have around this. Again, what I would really recommend is doing some practice questions on this particular topic. I believe Checkpoints has added some new questions, so you could borrow them from your school library if you don't have it already. Otherwise, even going online and finding different resources would work great for these types of questions because we can't do put them in for 3 to 4 marks, and sometimes students struggle because of how new it is. Okay, this is very important to remember because this comes as a multiple choice question. But understanding that if you do not experience positive mental well being, you could be experiencing these few conditions. So you could have stress, you could have anxiety, or you could have phobia. So the differences between them is that stress and anxiety can both contribute to mental health disorders, but phobia is a diagnosable mental health disorder. Someone who is qualified as a health practitioner must tell you, hey, you have a phobia. And while stress and anxiety can be considered normal in certain situations, so like if you're stressed about your exams right now, that is normal. You're expected to do that. If you have a bit of anxiety, that is normal. But you shouldn't have a phobia of exams because a phobia is an irrational and very, very, what you call it, irrational and like very big fear of something. So it's not considered normal because it's not helping you with your functioning. It's not helpful at all, while stress and anxiety can be helpful at times. But the key difference between them is actually in the last row. When you are stressed, it's a present moment thing. So you normally know the cause of that stressor. If I am stressed because I didn't study for my genetics test and I'm doing the test right now, I know my stressor is the test. If I'm stressed about the fact that, oh my gosh, I'm late for work, I know I am stressed because it's in that moment. But if it's something like anxiety, it's very future focused. And often the reason is not known. Sometimes you can be like, oh, I just feel anxious about my exam, or I just feel anxious about something. And then you have to, I suppose, dig a bit deeper to find out what is that anxiety stemming from. In contrast, a phobia, you always know the source because it's one source producing a consistent magnified response within the particular patient. So we learned about the different factors that contribute to a specific phobia, and we also learned about their interventions. So I have explanations of them coming up. But essentially, what I want to talk about is that they are paired. Think about them in terms of paired things, okay? So here, if we're looking at GABA dysfunction, the way to fix GABA dysfunction is by the use of GABA agonists or medication that is going to mimic the role of GABA within the brain. If you're looking at the fact that you have a lot of long-term potentiation, so you have the activation of that neural pathway in the brain that is linking the phobia, let's say I have a phobia for rats, to the fear response, you are going to elicit a particular physiological response to that, like a panic attack or like an anticipatory anxiety attack. In which case, something like breathing retraining, learning how to breathe properly, learning how to manage those physiological symptoms can be quite helpful. You could have psychological contributing factors. So the fact that you're developing a phobia as a result of classical conditioning and then continuing that for operant conditioning. What you really need, I think cognitive biases are they're all coupled together here. What you really need then is something that can challenge the way that you are thinking about this topic and then change your thinking, which is where we come to cognitive behavioral therapy instead. Or something like systematic desensitization, which is continually breaking the association between the phobic stimulus and the fear response, so you're not being as scared anymore. And we could have social contributing factors. So the specific environmental trigger is essentially the moment in time when you started getting scared of something. So if you're scared of heights, maybe it happened when you were on a ski trip and you were on those like what do you call them? Like the little, the boxes that you sit on and you just move across. I'm really forgetting the name. Don't hold me accountable to this. Um, if you're sitting on them and then the wind shakes them, you're probably scared for your life, and as a result, you just manifest that fear as a fear of heights instead of just the fact that it was the wind. Or something that you could have is stigma around seeking treatment, around mentioning your phobia because people may be judging you, or you may think yourself that people will judge you. In which case, you need something like psychoeducation, where we're teaching your family and your friends and your supporters, hey, this is a phobia. These are the different components of a phobia, and this is how you can support and challenge your loved ones' thinking so that they can get out of it instead. Okay? So, what I've given you here, actually, these formulas for these types of questions that you can use, and something that I want you guys to take away here are the key terms that you must use as well. So when we're talking about benzodiazepines, you always have to talk about GABA. And what is GABA? Because if you're going to mention this is a GABA agonist, the examiner has to know, why do we care about GABA in the first place? Right? You must mention its function. But you must also say near the end that benzodiazepine agents or GABA agonists can only ever cure the symptoms. They can help manage the symptoms. They cannot cure the phobia itself because the phobia is like a mental representation of the fear. You actually have to have some form of therapy in order to cure it. You will never cure a phobia via biological interventions. This is just to make sure that you are calm and stable enough to deal with the fear or talk about the fearful stimulus instead. Okay, I hope that makes sense. When we talk about things like breathing retraining, where looking at again the response, that what is the problem in the first place? The problem is you've breathed incorrectly, and as a result of that, you actually have too little carbon dioxide levels. Normally, people say you don't have enough um, oxygen, but because we're hyperventilating, we're taking really like fast and deep breaths. We're releasing too much carbon dioxide, and as a result of that, we don't have enough in our blood. You need carbon dioxide in your body as well because it's converted into different compounds, and then it helps keep the pH of your blood. If the pH goes like a ray, in that particular case, your body is just getting really panicked and then things don't work out. Then you want to give like a definition of what is breathing retraining. So talking about taking in calm, controlled breaths at a measured rate in through the nose, out through the mouth. And then you want to mention what is it going to do? It's going to restore that carbon dioxide to oxygen balance, but in doing so, it's going to reduce the parasympathetic nervous system dominance. You must talk about the nervous system when it comes to breathing retraining. If you're talking about the social intervention of psychoeducation for families, you want to define what is that intervention, right? So maybe it's a psychologist telling your friends, hey, Lavanya has this particular, I don't know, phobia of rats. And then you got to identify a particular aspect. So maybe it's the fact that I avoid places that can have rats, so I just don't go outside. Or I have unrealistic thoughts saying, oh my gosh, the moment I see a rat, it's just going to grow in size and it's going to eat me away. Now, what you can do to challenge them is limit things like catastrophic thinking and saying, no, a rat cannot grow in size. Even if it comes near you, you could run away. Or the fact that a rat bite doesn't hurt too much. Or the fact that rats are also scared of you, they're not going to approach you, right? Or if it's about not encouraging avoidance behaviors, you could say, hey, maybe we could actually try going to this place. We'll go in front of the street where there's a pet shop that keeps rats, right? It's not about forcing people to deal with their phobia that has a worse impact because you're just creating more negative memories. That forceful thinking of like flushing as a response does not work out. Something you could have in contrast is psychological interventions that do work. So you could have cognitive behavioral therapy, where you're thinking about aspects of cognitive restructuring, so changing the way you think about a particular thing. So if you're scared of rats, changing, okay, well, what can a rat do to you? And then having behavioral strategies. What can you do to calm yourself down? Right? So in reality, a rat cannot do much to me because it's very small. My house is very clean, so there shouldn't be rats here. But if I saw a rat, I should, calm down. Maybe I should call someone for help who can take the rat away, and I should try and breathing properly so that I'm not too panicked about it. So those are the ways that you can ensure that you're trying to break the association between the fear and the phobic stimulus. And you can use both of these together. They are interchangeable. So you could start with a behavioral intervention and then go to cognitive. Both are acceptable. Or you could have systematic desensitization. This is possibly one of my favorite ones because you work with a psychologist and then you learn a relaxation technique, aka breathing retraining, essentially. And then you create a fear hierarchy of, okay, if I see a cartoon of a mouse, I'm not that scared. If I see a picture, I'm more scared. If I see like too many mice together, I'm even more scared. If I see the mouse in person, I'm very scared. And if the mouse is walking on me, like I'm pretty much going to be dead. So you create that fear hierarchy from least to most anxiety inducing. And a psychologist works with you to gradually expose you to each level. And essentially, you try the breathing retraining again at each level so that your mind is now starting to associate the phobic stimulus with a relaxation response instead of a panicked response. And that's going to help break that association between the phobic stimulus and the fear response. So, again, the purpose behind giving you guys these sample question and answer formulas is so that you could use them, you could apply them within your responses, and then check, are you getting full marks or not? I would anticipate you should be getting full marks after using them, but again, just have a try of it instead. Now, we have different things that we could do to maintain mental well-being. There's always general advice like, eat well, sleep well, remain hydrated. You could tell that I'm very hydrated today. But we also have specific advice from those from indigenous backgrounds. So, one of the things we have is cultural continuity. The idea that it's an individual's responsibility to preserve their historical traditions of a culture and carry them forward because we recognize that individually, if you have a strong cultural identity, you're more likely to have social and emotional well-being because you're related to your culture, you value country, you value the relationships of your family and the community. And we believe that if you have those areas of your life managed well, you're also going to have positive impacts on your physical and your mental well-being. But if we have something like self determination, that is actually a social trait, ensuring that on a government, on a political level, Indigenous communities have the power to make their own decisions, whether it's in politics, whether it's in finance, whether it's deciding what they do with their own life. Because if you have agency over what you do, um, you have good mental well being. You're able to take the actions that you want to undertake, and you're able to do what it is that you want to do in life. So it's showing a really high level of functioning if you have that agency. Okay. This is what I was referring to in terms of the general advice. The specific ones I'll talk about is cognitive behavioral strategies. They're very similar to cognitive behavioral therapy. The therapy is just used for a phobia. Cognitive behavioral strategies can be used for anything. If you're just normally stressed about a test, if you're stressed about moving across the country, stuff like that. Whereas mindfulness meditation, we're actually looking at the idea that you must be present in the moment and you have to control your breaths. You must be relaxed, but at the same time, you have to let go of the incessant thoughts that are just coming around in your head. The idea is to not judge those thoughts, but rather to let them come in and to let them pass so that you feel calm and you realize that even if I have thoughts, I have control over those thoughts. And because I have control, I could manage these things, right? Makes you feel a bit more calm as a result of that. And you could also get like social support from family or friends and community. The only thing is that the support must be authentic in the sense that someone who is giving you that support must be having your best interests in their heart, and the support must be energizing. So, let's say I go to my parents to ask advice, but they end up giving me like a 3 hour lecture. Maybe I'm not going to find that energizing because I didn't want help in that specific way. Maybe I just wanted support by having someone who could listen to my problem, right? Rather than straight up give me advice. That's what we mean. Support must be given in a way that someone wishes to receive it. Okay? I hope that makes sense. Because now we're actually going to move on into like scientific skills. There's not too much here, but I do want to go through the basics. So you would remember that we have things like the independent variable, which is the IB, something that the researcher changes, compared to the dependent variable, which changes as a result of the IV changing. Now, each year in the exam, they have like a full page worth of questions on scientific skills. You cannot disregard them, which is why I'm rehashing them again and just making sure that you guys are clear on the distinction. If we have an extraneous variable, it's essentially a variable other than the IV that has the potential to change the DV, but it hasn't changed it yet because if it's extraneous, we've already thought about it. So if I've said, okay, I'm doing an experiment on sleep, but if I have people from all these different ages, the age is going to be an extraneous variable where I see differences rather than the actual, I don't know, machinery or something like that. Whereas a confounding variable is something that has already impacted your results and it's not the IV. So a confounding variable could be, oops, I already chose different genders and maybe the genders are doing a particular change in the study. I hope that makes sense. Because we also have different things like experimental designs. So I have a way of thinking about this with my hands. So if it's something like a between subjects design, the idea is you're either part of the control group or the experimental group, right? And you must be aware of the names of these experimental designs, so their advantages and disadvantages. So for a between subjects design, it's really good. It's quite quick for participants. The attrition rate or the rate of participants leaving the program is quite low because it doesn't take that long. But it means that because you only have a limited number of people, you may be introducing individual participant differences. Right? So if we're doing an experiment on like measuring heart rate in a stress response, and I'm an athlete and everyone else in my group is an athlete, or majority of the people are, our stress levels are going to be different because of the training that we have received. So it's bringing in essentially a confounding variable or an extraneous variable, depending on when you look at it. And what can also happen is, as a result of that, to balance out those variables, you need a bigger sample size, and sometimes that's hard to achieve. So we have something called a within subjects design. So notice how they're intertwined with each other. This is when each participant acts as their own control. They're part of both experimental conditions. So it does take longer. People do tend to leave quite a lot, but now you don't have those individual participant effects anymore. Whereas something like a mixed design is when you could mix and match the aspects of between subjects and within subjects. Normally, you could also have like multiple IVs in a mixed design. So thinking about how time can be an IV as well. This kind of stuff is not explicitly part of the study design, but quite often we can be asked to display reasons or what are some of the confounding effects that you could have. So in explaining that or in recognizing what they are, I'm just covering this. You could have something like the experimenter effect, where essentially, if the experimenter wants a particular result, they can be biased in the way that they're delivering instructions to people, and that can cause changes in people's behavior, right? So, in order to prevent that, we should have something like a double blind procedure where both parties, the participants and the researchers, are unaware of the true purpose of the research so they can give an unbiased viewpoint. You could have standardized instructions and procedures, so they all have the same instructions, they have the same procedure, so they do not have those extraneous variables. Something that is a single blind procedure is when the researchers know what's the experiment, participants don't. So it still helps control for some of those unwanted expectations that a participant can have. Because participants are very nice. If they think that the experimenter wants a particular type of result, they will act in that particular way so that people get the result, right? Whereas experimenters just want to get the actual accurate data instead. We have something like sampling. So there are two different types that you're expected to be aware of. You have random sampling, kind of like pulling names out of a hat. Every member of population of research interest has an equal chance of being selected as part of the sample. You could have stratified sampling where actually you're dividing the population up into stratas based or groups based on different characteristics, and then you're judging those groups on the size as well. So 50% of people, I don't know, have black hair, only 20% have like blonde hair, 20% have like brown hair, 10% have red hair. In that particular case, you're going to take samples depending on that particular ratio. So you're going to get more people who have black hair and less people who have red hair as well. There's an example on the screen if that didn't fully make sense. But we also have allocation. So sampling is, okay, how do we select members from the population? Allocation is we have our sample. How do we put them into experimental or control groups? So normally we try to use random allocation if it's a between subjects design, in which case, participants would normally be allowed in either the experimental or control group. Again, you could pull names out of a hat, so each individual has an equal chance of being in one particular group, and we're not particularly segregating people depending on their traits. Just very quickly about data as well. Um, we do deal with two main types of data in psychology. It's either qualitative in the sense that you're getting verbal output from patients about qualities or characteristics, like how did you sleep, compared to quantitative data where we're getting numbers of what is your EEG recording, right? We could have primary data. So primary data is something that the researcher collects themselves. They've run the methods, they've run the experiment, and now they have results. Compared to secondary data where you have results from another source, somebody else has conducted this experiment, but you're just analyzing what it is. And there are also two main statistics that you need to be aware of. There are only two. One is the mean, which is talking about the average of all scores. And this is best used for, scores are kind of like clumped together, they're not true spread out. Now, you won't really be asked to calculate this as part of your exam, but you should be aware of what it is. And you could have something called standard deviation. So standard deviation is just showing you what is the spread of information away from the mean. If you have a high standard deviation, it means, there's a lot of spread between the scores. Whereas if you have a low standard deviation, it means the spread between the scores is very low, so it's quite a skinny graph. Now, either can be good depending on the type of experiment that you're running. So it's not about, okay, which one is good or not. It's about recognizing what standard deviation is, because you can be asked about it as part of multiple choice, but you won't be expected to calculate it. If you do methods though, methods or special, you would already know how to calculate it. Okay. We also have some other methods of judging our experiments. So we have things like repeatability. So repeatability and reproducibility make up reliability as a whole, but that's not part of the study design anymore. If you do any past exam questions, you will find that they still have the term. So you can still attempt the question, just answer in these terms. If something is repeatable, we can undertake the experiment in the exact same conditions with the exact same researcher and materials and get a consistent result. If something is reproducible, maybe you're changing the experimenter, maybe you're changing the materials, but you're still getting similar results. So it's a measure of how consistent are your results in the same conditions or in slightly different conditions as well. On the other hand, for something like validity is saying, are you actually testing what you said you were going to measure? That's what we refer to as internal validity, right? How accurately are you judging it, right? Whereas if it's something like external validity, that's saying, I have these results. Can I generalize it to the population of interest? So is it actually applicable? Are my findings robust enough that I can apply it to a bunch of different people, right? Um, and accuracy in general. Oops. I'll just say it here. Accuracy in general is just how close are you to the true value. Normally, we don't have a true value. If you have a large enough sample size, you can assume you're getting closer to the true value. So I just talked about what a generalization is, but it's really important to recognize, what do we need to make a generalization. You must ensure that your experiment is actually ethical, right? That it doesn't have any major extraneous or confounding variables, that you haven't used convenience sampling where you've just picked people from the side of the road without counting for their characteristics. And you haven't used a very small sample size of maybe like 5, 10 participants, because then you cannot generalize to like millions of people, essentially. We also have our different ethical principles. So we have the idea that we have to be uh, protective of participants' information. None of the information should be identifiable in any particular way. It should not be misused either. And that's where confidentiality comes in as well, that you're not sharing participant information that is identifiable. You want to have voluntary participation. So making sure that participants are taking part in your study because they want to, and it's not because you have coerced them in any way, or because you've put a monetary reward and now they can't be part of the experiment. They can't get the money if they're not part of the experiment, or the fact that if they don't take part, they're going to get punished instead. You must have voluntary participation. And you must have withdrawal rights. At any given point in time, no questions asked. If a participant wants to leave an experiment and they want to take away their data with them, they are free to do so. Okay, you cannot force them. We also have things like informed consent, where before beginning an experiment, you must tell the you must tell the participant everything that there is to do with it. If your experiment involves deception, you can twist things around, but the participant must be aware of the overall risks. They must know about their withdrawal rights. They must know that it's voluntary participation. They must understand what's at stake here. Okay? So if the participant is not able to do so, their guardian can do it instead. You could have debriefing. It is ethically allowed. You could have deception, because sometimes you're running experiments and if participants know what you're judging, They're going to give you a very fabricated response that's going to essentially ruin your results, and you don't want that happening. So you can do that as long as the deception is not causing any like long-term damage. And you debrief the participants at the end. So you tell them, hey, this was our experiment, this is what we actually wanted to do, and this is the results that we got. So you're revealing that deception and telling participants what's at stake. Okay, now that we have finished the content, so like I said, it was a very speedy lesson. I would not recommend relying on just this as part of your exam prep. But the idea is to see, okay, how much did you remember? What are the different things that we learn about as part of the content? And in what ways can you be tested on them? So now that you are sitting, in a space of time where the exam is not started, but exam preparation has started, I really want you guys to recognize how it is that you study because this truly makes a difference. And studying right now, even though it's September, maybe you still have school going on or it's the holidays, this is the time to make the most out of everything. Because when I did year 12, there are moments when I think, okay, maybe I could have done more, right? There's always a time when you can do more. Unless you're studying 24 hours a day, you can always do more, right? So when we're starting exam preparation, I would not recommend just rereading your notes. That's a very passive method of learning something. And it also means that you're just going to start from the start of the year. Maybe you're very confident in that area. You, as a student, preparing for your exam, need to recognize that your key goals here are to figure out areas where you are weak and to figure out how you answer questions in a way that the exam tests. To answer questions, you need knowledge in the first place. So, what I would recommend is have a really good understanding of the study design and the dot points in there. Literally print out a copy of the study design, or if you can't print it out, just have one in front of you online and think about okay, what are each of these dot points? And on a scale of 1 to 5, how would I rank my understanding and my current confidence? You must always start with a baseline, right? As science students, we should really be aware of this. Set your baseline. So if I know I'm very confident in like nervous system, but I'm not as confident in like neurotransmitter stuff, start your exam preparation with neurotransmitters. But at the same time, depending on your score, you need to take different actions. Because if you're saying, okay, I'm like 5 out of 5 confident in nervous system, you got to go ahead and start with practice questions. If you're like 3 out of 5 confident in neurotransmitters, I would still say start with practice questions so that you can think about, okay, how much information do you actually know? If for some reason you are at a 0 or a 1 for a particular topic because you've completely forgotten it or you never knew what it was, that's when you go back to your notes and you go ahead and say, okay, let me learn this content first. Let me clear out my doubts. And then you attempt practice questions. Do not negate doing practice questions. Okay, it's very, very important. You got to do as much of them as possible. But when I say that, I don't just mean do 50 practice questions a day and just keep on doing that. Because any practice without conscious like observation of your results is useless. All you're going to do is you're going to practice doing the wrong scale, which is actually more detrimental, right? So anytime you're doing practice question, even if you feel like it's hard to balance psychology practice with all your other exams, maybe just do 2 or 5 questions a day. Look at your responses, compare it to a model answer, ask someone for feedback. Check it yourself. Ask your teacher, ask your friends, ask your tutor. Anyone who can give you any piece of feedback because you have to have a comparison between where are you right now and where do you want to be, right? Start noticing those patterns because you should be realizing and thinking about this from a very strategic viewpoint. Strategy is everything, right? It's not just okay, like I know the content. 20% of any exam is actually your exam skills, which is your preparation strategy and how you attempt it. So I would really think, am I getting questions wrong in a particular area of study? Because then I need to work on that area of study. I need to put in more time into it. Am I getting questions wrong because my time management is not good? Maybe I'm not able to think about the responses so fast, or maybe I'm not able to write fast enough. Those are two separate issues. You need to deal with them in different ways, right? If it's a time management problem, maybe try handwriting your notes. Maybe try handwriting different things so that your hand actually gets used to writing for long periods of time. And that's really important. Please, before your exam, make sure you've done practice for the whole 2 hours and 45 minutes. I don't care if you finish early, you've got to train yourself to sit in that place and think about how do I review questions? How do I write? How do I deal with stress? Emulate exam conditions as much as possible. Okay. If you're someone who's struggling because you're like, okay, I can't think of what to write, well, then the problem is in the content, right? The problem is you maybe don't understand what's required, or you're having trouble encoding what, or decoding, I suppose, what the command term is saying. Like, what do we require for a describe question compared to an explain, compared to a justify? Be very mindful about where your issues lie. And you know how you be mindful? By taking a note of it. Keep a mistake log. It doesn't have to be something fancy, okay? When I kept a mistake log, all I did was I would just take pictures of the questions I got wrong and I would just put them in a Google Doc because I'm not very good with things like Notion or Google Sheets. But something that I did do was I kept essentially like a table where I was noting down how many marks am I getting. Now, that could be according to area of study, that could be according to practice papers, because unless you are numerically testing yourself, you're going to be under a delusion, essentially, or you can be, where you're like, no, I'm doing pretty well. Pretty well is not good enough. You got to say, am I doing 90% well? Am I doing 80% well? Am I doing 70% well? Because then you can start to see, okay, where are the areas where you need to put in the work, right? Be very mindful. It's still not too late to be taking those decisions and working on that. When you do this, again, make sure that you're looking at model responses. Make sure that you are planning out um, the way that you revise. So setting up enough time to do practice questions close to your exam, making sure that you're kind of moving through them as the years. I would highly recommend saving something like the 2024 exam to like at least a week or like up to a week before your actual psychology exam. Okay? And please, for the love of God, do not leave exam revision to the end because you will regret it. Don't think that I have 3 days before the psychology exam, so I can study in that time because that time is not efficient. You will be stressed by that time. So anything that you do study is less likely to be impacted, right? And psychology is really a subject where if you put in the work, you can get in a very good score. A lot of students try for it, and a lot of students are compensated well for the level of effort that they generate. So make sure you're doing that. And make sure you also have a strategy of how on earth are you going to attempt the exam. So that doesn't just mean practicing the content and the questions, that's practicing order. So when I did the exam, I did it multiple choice and then short answer questions. Now, take this as not. This was my practice because when I do multiple choice questions, I can sort of remember what my answer is for each point. So I can be done with all multiple choice questions within 15 minutes of the exam. It's a great time saver for me. You might be different. Maybe you're better than me. Maybe you take a bit longer for multiple choice questions and you need to spend sort of like more time on them. Allocate time according to your patterns. Like I said, notice your patterns. If there's anything do you take away from today, it's patterns, the P word. And then, come the exam day, I actually thought, you know what, a couple of these multiple choice, maybe I'm not too good at it. Let me read the whole paper. Now, that's not something that I did in my practice. And when I read the whole paper, I found out that I hadn't prepared one question for mindfulness meditation. And I had a huge panic on the day of my psychology exam. And I'm pretty sure it didn't impact my score too much. Mentally, I was very stressed, right? So that's what I'm saying. Stick to the practices that work. Don't be switching up things on exam day, right? But at the same time, I suppose if you're finding out that you're really struggling, do feel free to switch up. You are humans, you are adaptable as well. For something like the 10 marker, I would highly recommend planning your responses out in first. That means dedicating enough time. Even if it's 10 marks, and normally I say it's like a minute per mark or 2 minutes per mark, try to give yourself like about half an hour to do that 10-mark response. You got to plan it all out. It's not just about giving information, it's about ensuring a flow of information as well and giving in as much detail, as many examples as you possibly can. It's kind of like an essay that you're writing. So make sure you're prepared for that. If you are someone who's really struggling with timing your um, 10 markers, start with doing them untimed and then force yourself to just have half an hour to have 40 minutes to do it. Your brain, once it has like a time limit, automatically gets used to dealing with the time pressure. All right? Keep those things in mind. Be ready with things like your pens, things like your stationery. Get used to being awake at the time of your exam. Psych is at 9 a.m. If you're someone who wakes up later than that, make sure a couple of weeks before your exam date, you're waking up earlier than that. I kid you not, I had my exam, not for psychology, for another subject, and a few students came late and they looked so regretful about that fact because it's easy to miss things. It's easy for things to go wrong. Make sure you have contingency plans in place so that things don't go wrong and you're as less stressed as possible. Okay? That's sort of what I'm going to say for now. The one other thing that I wanted to say actually for a 10 marker is please know your study design very well because the 10 marker is not just here write about memory. A 10 marker is tell me everything you know about memory. You are expected to flaunt your understanding to the examiner. So it means that you are expected to link between different areas of study. And how do you do that? If you know the study design dot points well. I know it seems weird to say, but memorize the study design dot points so that you know what it is you have to talk about. For my exam in 2023, for instance, we had the gut brain axis. That is one study design dot point, right? There is not a lot of information you can write about the gut brain axis by itself. But because I knew the study design well, I could connect it to things like stress, I could connect it to things like neurotransmitters and the nervous system, and hence learning and memory. And when you're making all those connections, you're showing the examiner, I have a deep understanding of this topic. It's not just surface level. And that's what convinces them to give you marks. So I got 10 out of 10 on my exam 10 marker. And that's why I'm really recommending know your study design well. I got this advice when I used to be a student and I used to attend these same Airtanats lectures, and the tutor back then gave the same advice. I applied it, it works wonderfully. Please apply it as well. Okay? Think about the structure. A lot of the time you're expected to write in paragraphs, but there have been some practice exams where they are expected you to write like notes. So use things like headings, subheadings as well. Okay. If you have time, you could highlight the keywords for the examiner just so that it's very easy for them to pick out things. If not, please highlight words of the question, like command terms or what it is that you're expecting, or number of marks, so that when you're doing your review, you have specific things to look at. You're not just mindlessly reading through your responses, not taking anything in. The review process is very important, especially if you know someone who's very prone to making mistakes. That is the chance for you to. Oh, my English keeps on leaving me. That is a chance for you to essentially correct yourself, you know, is what I'm trying to say. Okay, but that being said, once the exam is actually finished, I'm expecting you guys would have other exams, so you could focus on that, or if you're finished somehow, you could try to take the day off, you could try to relax as well. Please, for your own mental well being, don't try and discuss the exam questions with others, even if someone has written something and their response is wrong, because their response is different, you're going to have anxiety about it. If not in the short term, you could have it long term as well until the day your exams get released. You do not want that anxiety, you do not want that stress impacting your other future exams. Okay? So just be very careful of that. I will leave you guys here, but I hope that you took away something useful from this lesson. Make the most out of this study period before your exams. Reach for as much support as you can and be strategic. Make sure that whatever you do, you can look back on this time and you are not regretting your potential. Okay? Thank you for coming, and I hope that you guys could attend future lectures as well. Bye bye.